From the very beginning, her world was different. While other children spent their afternoons chasing after soccer balls or riding bikes through the dusty streets of her small town, she was often found lying flat on her back in the grass, her eyes locked on the open sky. She was mesmerized by the sound of rotor blades whenever a helicopter passed overhead. To her, that heavy thumping sound wasn't noise, it was a call, a promise, a vision of where she wanted to be one day. She was the daughter of ordinary working-class parents. Her father worked long hours at a local factory, and her mother balanced home duties with part-time jobs. They raised her with love, but also with practicality. In her parents' eyes, dreams were luxuries useful only if they could put food on the table or lead to stable work. Her fascination with helicopters seemed to them like an innocent phase. "You'll outgrow it," her mother would say with a gentle smile, brushing back her hair. "One day you'll find something more realistic." But it wasn't just a phase. It was an obsession. She would run outside whenever she heard that distant thump-thump in the sky. Her neighbors thought she was strange, while other girls were indoors scrolling through their phones or gossiping about boys. She was sketching helicopters in her notebooks. She knew their names: Apache, Chinook, Black Hawk. She memorized their designs as if they were old friends. Her classmates teased her endlessly. "You? A pilot? You can barely reach the pedals of a car." One boy sneered during recess. She swallowed the laughter, but inside, a flame only grew stronger. School didn't help. Teachers nudged her toward careers they thought fit her better: nursing, teaching, or office work. When she once wrote an essay describing her dream of becoming a military helicopter pilot, her teacher graded it down and scribbled in the margins, "Interesting story, but think about something practical." The words stung. She didn't want to write stories, she wanted to live them. By the time she hit high school, her dream had become something she carried in secret. She learned to stop talking about it out loud because it only invited more ridicule. Friends told her she was crazy. Even her family started to push her toward better options. But in the quiet of her room at night, she'd open her laptop and watch videos of pilots training, landing, rescuing. She studied the way they spoke, the commands they gave, the discipline they showed. She imagined herself inside the cockpit, headset on, voice steady, eyes sharp. And then came the phrase that would shape her future. One summer afternoon, she and a group of classmates were walking past a field where a National Guard unit was training. A Black Hawk helicopter roared overhead, dipping low enough for them to feel the air whip against their faces. The boys in the group started shouting, imitating pilots and laughing at one another. Someone nudged her and said mockingly, "Hey, why don't you fly it? You always say you love those things." She didn't hesitate. She looked up at the helicopter and said with quiet confidence, "I can fly it." For a split second, there was silence. And then came the explosion of laughter. Her friends doubled over, holding their stomachs. "You? Fly a Black Hawk? You can't even drive a stick shift," one boy howled. Another shook his head, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. "That's the funniest thing I've ever heard." She smiled faintly, but inside, her chest tightened. The ridicule cut deep. That phrase, "I can fly," it was replayed again and again, always in mocking tones. Every time she dared bring up her dream, it became a running joke at school. To them, it was proof that she was delusional. But to her, it became a promise. She started working harder than ever. She spent hours in the library, researching aviation requirements. She discovered that to become a pilot in the U.S. Army, she'd need to pass rigorous physical exams, survive tough academic training, and earn a spot in one of the most competitive programs in the military. It was overwhelming, but it didn't scare her. If anything, It gave her direction. For the first time, she had a roadmap. Still, reality was unkind. Her grades weren't perfect, and her family lacked the money for expensive flight schools. Her parents were skeptical when she announced her plans. "The army is no place for you," her father said firmly. "It's dangerous. It's not for girls like you." Her mother, softer but equally doubtful, added, "We just don't want to see you get hurt. Maybe aviation isn't the right path. You could be a nurse, or maybe an engineer." She nodded respectfully, but inside thought, "You don't see me yet." Graduation day came. While her classmates celebrated college acceptance letters and safe career paths, she filled out paperwork for the Army. When her decision became public, the ridicule returned. "She thinks she's gonna fly a helicopter." One former classmate scoffed, "I give her a month before she comes running back home." Their laughter echoed in her memory, becoming fuel. The first weeks of basic training were brutal. Every muscle in her body ached. She was pushed beyond limits she didn't know she had. Many nights, she lay in bed, wondering if the doubters were right. But whenever the thought of quitting crossed her mind, she remembered that hot summer day, the Black Hawk roaring above, and her own words, "I can fly it." Those words weren't a joke anymore. They were her vow. It was during this time that she truly began to transform. What started as a dream slowly hardened into determination. She grew stronger, faster, more disciplined. Drill sergeants barked orders. Peers mocked her small frame, but she endured. She didn't just want to survive basic training, she wanted to excel, to stand out, to prove beyond doubt that she wasn't just another recruit chasing an impossible dream. And little by little, people started noticing. She was the first to wake up, and the last to quit during runs. She stayed late in the classroom, asking questions about mechanics and aerodynamics. When others groaned, she studied. When others gave up, she pushed through. The dreamer who once whispered to the sky was evolving into a soldier with purpose. Her journey was still long, and the mockery hadn't ended. But by the time she completed basic training, she was no longer the girl people laughed at in school. She was a woman in uniform, standing at the gates of her dream. And while many still doubted her, she carried inside her a fire that no laughter could extinguish. Because she knew sooner or later the chance would come to prove herself. And when it did, she wouldn't just say, "I can fly it." She would show them. The transition from basic training into aviation school wasn't smooth. If basic training had been a storm that tested her endurance, aviation school was a hurricane waiting to swallow her whole. She knew from the beginning that the road she had chosen wasn't the usual path, not for someone like her, not for someone with her background, and certainly not for a woman. From the moment she stepped into the hangar where the future pilots gathered, the weight of expectation, or rather, the lack of it, pressed down on her. Around her were men who had grown up building model airplanes, flying small aircraft in private clubs, or coming from military families steeped in aviation traditions. They carried themselves with an air of belonging. She, on the other hand, felt like an intruder in their world, a dreamer who had stumbled onto a stage where everyone else knew the script. The instructors didn't make it easier. Many carried years of combat flying experience, and though they were professionals, some wore skepticism openly on their faces. During introductions, when each trainee shared their background, she mentioned her small-town roots and her dream of flying Black Hawks. She caught the faintest smirk from one instructor, as though silently asking, "You? Really?" Training. Days were long, often beginning before sunrise and ending late into the night. The curriculum was merciless. Aviation theory, aerodynamics, navigation, emergency protocols, and the overwhelming mechanics of the aircraft themselves. Every button, every switch, every lever had a purpose. Memorizing them wasn't enough. She had to instinctively know them, as though the helicopter were an extension of her own body. At first, she struggled. Her mind was sharp, but the pace was brutal. Male peers who had tinkered with engines or flown civilian aircraft before breezed through lessons that left her reeling. More than once, she found herself sitting alone in the mess hall. Textbooks and manuals sprawled in front of her, whispering checklists under her breath, while others laughed and relaxed. And the laughter often included her. "You're too small." For the controls, one trainee joked as she walked into class. "Hope they have a booster seat for you. Better practice handing out coffee instead," another added with a chuckle. The joke stung, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she buried herself deeper into study. At night, when others slept, she stayed awake in the dim light of her dorm, flipping through manuals, reciting emergency procedures like prayers, forcing herself to learn until exhaustion blurred the words. Her determination began to show. While others dismissed small details, she mastered them. She could quote technical specifications from memory. She anticipated questions in class and answered with precision. Slowly, she carved out respect not because others wanted to give it, but because her effort demanded it. Yet respect was fleeting. Instructors still watched her with narrowed eyes, evaluating her every move with more scrutiny than they applied to her peers. A minor mistake in her checklist became a lecture. A hesitation during practice drills became a warning. It was clear. She wasn't being measured by the same yardstick. She was being tested harder, as if the very idea of her becoming a pilot had to be proven twice over. One moment stood out in her memory, a flight simulation exercise designed to test decision-making under pressure. Each trainee was given a scenario: engine failure at low altitude. The goal was to land safely with minimal damage. When her turn came, she gripped the simulator controls, heart pounding. The alarms blared, screens flashed red, voices barked in her headset. She reacted swiftly, recalling the exact procedure she'd memorized the night before. She angled the craft, adjusted the collective, and executed a textbook emergency landing. The instructor's eyebrow lifted ever so slightly. "Not bad," he muttered. For her, those two words felt like a medal. But for every small victory, it was another barrier. Physical training remained relentless. The Black Hawk wasn't. A delicate machine, it demanded strength. The cyclic and collective controls required stamina. The constant vibration of the aircraft tested endurance, and long hours of hovering demanded iron concentration. She built muscle, pushed through soreness, and ran extra miles to keep herself conditioned. When her arms shook from exhaustion, she told herself, one more rep, one more step, one more chance closer to proving them wrong. Still, doubts lingered. There were nights when she sat alone in her bunk, staring at her blistered hands, questioning whether the dream was worth the sacrifice. Could she ever silence the voices that mocked her? Could she ever step into the cockpit as an equal, not as a novelty? Then came a turning point. During a ground school lesson, the instructor asked for a volunteer to walk through the pre-flight checklist on a mock-up helicopter. No one raised their hand. The silence stretched, awkward and heavy. And then, before she could second-guess herself, her hand shot up. Climbing into the mock-up, she went through the checklist smoothly. Voice steady, actions precise. Every switch she flipped, every gauge she checked, was done with confidence born from hours of repetition. By the time she finished, the room was silent, not with laughter, but with surprise. The instructor nodded. "That's how it's done." In that moment, she felt a shift. For the first time, she wasn't the outsider fumbling for acceptance. She was a cadet who had earned recognition, if only briefly. From then on, she became relentless. She volunteered for every drill, stayed behind after every class, asked questions others were too tired to ask. While her peers coasted on natural ability, she built herself brick by brick. She wasn't the fastest, but she was the most determined. She wasn't the strongest, but she was the most disciplined. And she knew, deep down, that this was the road less taken. Most people would have chosen the easier path, the safe job, the predictable career, the life that kept dreams within reach of the ground. But she had chosen the sky, even if it meant facing ridicule, isolation, and obstacles stacked against her. As the weeks turned into months, she transformed. Her body grew stronger, her mind sharper, her focus unshakable. The girl who once whispered, "I can fly it," beneath the summer sun was becoming a soldier who could actually make good on that promise. And though the voices of doubt hadn't disappeared, they no longer carried the same weight. Because every hour she spent in the hangar, every checklist she nailed, every drill she survived, she was carving her own place in a world that had never been meant for her. It wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. It wasn't fair. But it was hers. The road less taken had become her road, and she was determined to follow it all the way to the cockpit of a Black Hawk. The closer she moved toward her dream, the louder the laughter seemed to get. It wasn't always direct. Sometimes it was a snicker when she walked past the hangar. Sometimes it was the roll of an eye when she raised her hand in class. And sometimes it was the sting of outright words, thrown like darts meant to pierce her resolve. She learned quickly that in aviation school, reputation was everything. A single mistake could cling to a trainee like oil to skin, impossible to scrub away. For her, the mistakes weren't just recorded, they were magnified, exaggerated, replayed as proof that she didn't belong. The first time she fumbled during a practice hover drill, the whispers started. Hovering a Black Hawk, even in a simulator, was notoriously difficult. The helicopter wanted to fight the pilot at every second, pulling one way then another. She corrected late, overcorrected, then lost control. The instructor stopped the drill and reset the simulator. No big deal, it was a common problem for first-timers. But not for her. By dinner that night, the story had spread across the barracks. "She can't even keep it steady for 5 seconds. Someone snorted at the table. Another chimed in, "Imagine her in combat. We'd be on the ground before the enemy even fired." The room erupted in laughter. She pretended not to hear, but the words clung to her like thorns. That night, lying in her bunk, she stared at the ceiling, replaying every movement she had made in the simulator, asking herself why her hands hadn't responded the way she'd trained them to. Doubt crept in, whispering that maybe the others were right. But then she remembered the summer afternoon back home, the Black Hawk roaring overhead, and her own voice, "I can fly it." That phrase had become a curse when others used it against her, but when she repeated it to herself in the dark, it became armor. The mockery grew bolder. During physical training, if she fell a step behind on long runs, someone would shout, "Don't worry, helicopters don't run." When she carried heavy gear across the training field, another voice would add, "That gear is heavier than you are." Laughter followed her like a shadow. Still, she refused to break. One afternoon, in the hangar, the mockery turned into a moment that would define her. The trainees were gathered around, waiting for their instructor to arrive. The conversation turned, as it often did, to flying. A group of men joked about the difficulty of piloting a Black Hawk in tight urban spaces. One of them looked at her with a smirk. "You really think you could handle that? Flying a Black Hawk into a city under pressure?" She met his gaze without blinking. "Yes, I can fly it." The room went silent for half a heartbeat before it exploded in laughter. It was the kind of laughter that fills a space, drowning out everything else. Some doubled over, clutching their sides. Others mimicked her words in high-pitched voices. "I can fly it. I can fly it." The phrase spread like wildfire, echoing off the metal walls. From that day forward, those 4 words became her label. Whenever she entered a room, someone would whisper them, and the others would chuckle. It was no longer just a joke. It was a way of branding her as foolish, naive, and out of her league. At first, the constant ridicule gnawed at her confidence. Every time she heard the words, her cheeks burned with shame. But slowly, something shifted. The mockery, instead of weakening her, started to fuel her. Each laugh became another reason to succeed. Each whisper became another push forward. If they wanted to mock her with her own words, then she would make those words unshakable truth. She doubled down on her training. While others relaxed after drills, she stayed in the hangar practicing procedures until her instructors had to send her away. She requested extra time in the simulator, determined to master the hover drill that had once embarrassed her. She studied weather patterns, emergency checklists, urban landing strategies, anything that could prepare her for the challenges ahead. One evening, long after most trainees had gone to bed, she was in the simulator alone. The digital black hawk hovered shakily as the artificial wind tried to push it off balance. Sweat ran down her temples as her fingers gripped the controls. This time, she didn't overcorrect. She didn't panic. She stayed calm, adjusting with micro movements, countering the wind until the helicopter steadied. The system beeped in acknowledgement of a successful hover. She exhaled, a long shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time, she felt it, not just the idea, but the reality. She could fly it. Yet the mockery didn't stop. In fact, the more progress she made, the louder it seemed to get. "She's just book smart," one trainee sneered. "Flying in real life is different." Another added, "She'll never have the instincts. You can't teach that." But what they didn't see was how much the ridicule was shaping her. She was learning to operate under pressure, not because of kindness or encouragement, but because of constant doubt. The mockery was building her into a pilot who could stay calm, even when the world expected her to fail. One instructor, a grizzled veteran with years of combat flying, noticed. He never joined in the jokes. Instead, he watched quietly, studying the way she reacted. After one particularly grueling drill, when she stayed behind to practice while others laughed their way out of the hangar, he approached her. "You know," he said, his voice low but steady. "They laugh because they're afraid. You remind them that maybe they're not working as hard as they should." She looked at him, startled. No one had ever said that before. He gave a small nod and added, "Don't let their noise distract you. Focus on the sky. That's where your answers are." It was the first time someone in authority had validated her effort. She carried those words like a lifeline. Over time, her resilience became impossible to ignore. The same trainees who once mocked her started watching when she stepped into the simulator. They expected failure, but what they saw was improvement. Her maneuvers were smoother, her decisions faster, her confidence unshakable. The laughter didn't stop overnight, but the edge of it dulled. Still, she knew the phrase, "I can fly it," would never leave her. It had become her burden and her motivation all at once. The mockery wasn't just background noise anymore. It was the drumbeat against which she was writing her story. She understood something important. In aviation, confidence wasn't enough. Proving herself wasn't about talking, it was about flying. And the moment would come when words wouldn't matter, when only action could silence the doubters. Until then, every sneer, every chuckle, every mocking echo of "I can fly it" pushed her harder. Because she knew, sooner or later, they would see. And when that day came, the phrase that once made them laugh would become the truth she had been building toward all along. Training was about to reach a new level. Up until now, everything she had faced, classroom lectures, grueling physical training, endless drills, And hours in simulators had been building toward a single purpose, to prepare her for her first real test. The instructors called it a simulation scenario, but everyone knew it was more than that. It was the moment that separated those who merely memorized checklists from those who could actually fly under pressure. The test had broken. More than a few trainees. Some washed out entirely after failing it. Others never recovered their confidence. For her, this wasn't just a test. It was the chance to prove that all the laughter, all the mockery, all the doubts weren't her story. The morning of the test, the air in the briefing room was thick with tension. The trainees sat shoulder to shoulder, flight suits crisp, notebooks open, pens tapping nervously against the desks. At the front of the room, an instructor, his face carved with years of flying in combat zones, outlined the challenge. You'll be tasked with landing a UH-60 Black Hawk on a rooftop in an urban environment, he explained. The conditions will simulate combat. Alarms, crosswinds, system failures. You will have to make quick decisions, control the aircraft, and put it down safely. No excuses. The words hit her like a spark. A rooftop landing. That was the kind of maneuver she had dreamed about. The kind she had studied late into the night, imagining herself guiding the helicopter with precision. But she also knew what failure would mean. Whispers rippled through the room as the briefing ended. Some of the men exchanged smirks, and one muttered just loud enough for her to hear, "Well, we already know who's going to crash." Laughter bubbled around him. She sat straighter in her chair, jaw tightening. She had heard it all before, and she had prepared for this moment. When her name was called, she rose, her boots clicking against the floor as she walked to the simulator chamber. The room was dimly lit, the massive dome of screens looming over the cockpit mock-up. Instructors watched from a control booth behind glass, their expressions unreadable. Fellow trainees stood in the back, waiting to see if the girl who had claimed, "I can fly it," could actually prove it. She climbed into the seat, strapped in, and placed her hands on the controls. The simulator came alive, the roar of the engines, the vibrations of the aircraft, the dizzying display of a city skyline spread out around her. "Begin," came the instructor's voice through her headset. Immediately, alarms blared. Red lights flashed across the console. The artificial Black Hawk bucked as crosswinds pushed against it. Her heart hammered, but her hands stayed steady. She had practiced for this. She heard the mocking voices in her head, but she pushed them aside, replacing them with the endless hours of repetition. She started her descent toward the rooftop. The building loomed ahead, surrounded by taller structures that created dangerous wind tunnels. She could feel the simulated helicopter fighting her, drifting off course. She countered with precise adjustments, nudging the cyclic, managing the collective, eyes darting between gauges and the skyline. "Too low," the instructor's voice warned. She corrected smoothly. Crosswind increasing. She anticipated it, adjusting her angle before the gust even struck. Sweat trickled down her back, but her breathing was steady. Around her, alarms screamed, red lights flashed like angry eyes, and the city rushed closer. The rooftop was small, barely enough space for the helicopter's skids. One wrong move, and the simulation would mark her as a failure. The whispers of doubt returned in her mind. She can't do it. She'll never make it. She's not built for this. And then she heard her own voice, clear and sharp. "I can fly it." The helicopter steadied. The rooftop rose beneath her. Inch by inch, she lowered the Black Hawk, compensating for every gust of wind, every warning alarm. Dust swirled across the digital rooftop as the skids touched down with a solid thud. The alarms went silent. "Simulation complete," the instructor announced. For a moment, the room was silent too. She sat frozen, her hands still gripping the controls, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Then she slowly exhaled, unstrapped herself, and stood. Through the glass, she saw the instructor's face stone-like as always, but his eyes held something different. Not doubt, not disdain, but the faintest flicker of respect. Behind her, the silence stretched. Sane trainees who had laughed at her now shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, others muttered to themselves. No one clapped, no one cheered, but she didn't need them to. The rooftop was hers. When she stepped out of the simulator chamber, one of the louder skeptics smirked half-heartedly. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. That night, alone in her room, she replayed the simulation in her mind. The alarms, the flashing lights, the crosswinds, it had all felt so real. For the first time, she had faced the chaos of flight under pressure, and she hadn't crumbled. She had steadied the aircraft, made the right calls, and landed. It wasn't perfect. She knew that. There had been small corrections she could have made faster, tiny details she still had to master. But it was enough. Enough to show herself that she could handle the pressure. Enough to prove, if only quietly, that she was not a punchline. The next morning, as she walked into the hangar, the phrase echoed again. Someone whispered it under their breath. "I can fly it." But this time, the laughter that followed wasn't as loud. Something had changed. The first real test had been more than a simulation. It was the crack in the wall of disbelief that had surrounded her since she first spoke her dream. It wasn't total victory, not yet, but it was a foothold. And as she looked out at the real Black Hawks lined up on the tarmac, their rotor blades gleaming in the morning sun, she felt the weight of what was still ahead. The real tests would come, and they wouldn't be simulations, but she was ready. Because now, more than ever, she knew she could fly it. The day she had been waiting for finally arrived, the moment when the Black Hawk wouldn't just exist as a simulation on glowing screens, or as a hulking machine viewed from the tarmac. This time, it would be alive beneath her hands, blades, tearing the air, the horizon rushing to meet her. She woke before dawn, long before her alarm. Sleep had been a shallow guest the night before, slipping away every time her mind replayed checklists, procedures, and potential emergencies. She had gone over every scenario. She could imagine engine flameout, hydraulic failure, tail rotor issues. But the more she thought, the calmer she became. Preparation was her armor, and she had forged it piece by piece in the long nights of study and repetition. The airfield buzzed with activity that morning. The sun had not yet climbed high, and the cool mist clung to the ground, rolling lazily over the wide concrete expanse where the helicopters waited. The Black Hawks looked like predators at rest, their dark bodies crouched low, rotor blades stretching out like wings folded in patience. Her boots crunched against the gravel as she walked toward her assigned aircraft, helmet tucked under her arm. The instructors and ground crew stood nearby, some scribbling notes on clipboards, others chatting idly. She caught a few glances thrown her way, some curious, some skeptical, a few indifferent. She had grown used to those looks. Today, she told herself, they would see more than curiosity. Cadet, one of the instructors, called out as she approached. He was a seasoned pilot with a gravelly voice, his arms crossed firmly across his chest. He had flown in combat zones, guided soldiers into battle, and carried them out when the mission was over. His eyes measured her in silence for a moment, before he spoke again. "You ready?" "Yes, sir," she said, voice steady. "We'll see," he replied, then gestured toward the helicopter. She climbed into the cockpit, her heart hammering as her fingers brushed over the controls. The Black Hawk was massive, a machine built for war, but sitting in the pilot's seat, it felt intimate, like gripping the reins of something alive, powerful, and unpredictable. the pre-flight checks began. Her voice, clear but calm, echoed through the intercom as she read out each step. Systems green. Fuel levels correct. Hydraulics in range. Engine temp normal. Every response from the gauges was a nod of approval, as though the machine itself was granting her permission. When the instructor gave the order, she pressed the start switch. A low whine filled the cockpit as the turbines spooled up. The whine grew into a roar, and the massive rotor blades above her began to spin, slow at first, then faster, until the air around the aircraft trembled with energy. The sound was deafening. The vibration rattled through her chest. She had felt the simulation vibrate, but this was different, raw, visceral, alive. She tightened her grip on the cyclic, the collective resting beneath her other hand. Her thumb brushed the radio switch, her breathing steady. Black Hawk 1, cleared for takeoff. The tower's voice crackled through her headset. Roger, cleared for takeoff, she replied. This was it. Her stomach fluttered as she pulled gently on the collective. The helicopter responded, lifting slowly off the ground. The skids left the earth, and for a split second, it felt as though gravity hesitated, deciding whether to release her. Then the aircraft rose, steady and sure. She was flying. The ground slipped away beneath her. The runway shrank. The crews on the ground became small dots. The buildings at the edge of the airfield looked like toy blocks. Her heart raced, but her hands were steady. Every tiny adjustment she made to the controls translated into the Black Hawk's movement smooth, graceful, responsive. Not bad, the instructor muttered into her headset. His tone was deliberately flat, but she heard the concession hidden within it. The training exercise was straightforward. A climb to altitude, a series of controlled turns, speed adjustments, then an approach to a designated landing zone. But even routine missions demanded absolute precision. She banked the helicopter left, eyes scanning the horizon. The city stretched out in the distance, the morning sun glinting off rooftops and rivers. The rotor blades thumped above her, a deep rhythmic beat that echoed in her bones. Flying wasn't just control, it was rhythm. It was harmony between human and machine. And as she guided the Black Hawk higher, she felt that harmony settle into her. But the real test wasn't just flying in clear skies. Halfway through the exercise, the instructor triggered a simulated fault. Suddenly, a warning light blazed red on the console. Hydraulic pressure drop. Her training kicked in instantly. Hands steady, eyes darting across the gauges, she ran through the checklist in her head. Adjust power. Compensate with pedals. Maintain control. The helicopter shuddered, but she steadied it. Corrective action? The instructor demanded. Adjusting hydraulic load. Monitoring stability. Preparing for controlled descent if necessary, she replied without hesitation. The instructor said nothing more. She continued the flight, guiding the Black Hawk through turbulence, unexpected gusts, and simulated alarms. Each challenge tested, not just her skill, but her composure. And with every minute, her confidence grew. Finally, the time came for the landing. The designated zone was a patch of dirt near the far end of the training range, surrounded by obstacles designed to simulate an urban combat environment. Concrete barriers, rusted containers, and debris littered the area. Her approach had to be precise. The helicopter descended, rotors kicking up a storm of dust and grit. Visibility dropped, the world outside turning into a swirling brown haze. The cockpit shook violently as crosswinds clawed at the aircraft. Her voice remained calm as she called out the adjustments. Descent steady. Altitude 20 feet. Crosswind correction applied. The ground emerged from the dust, rough and uneven. She adjusted her angle, coaxing the helicopter into position. The skids touched the earth with a controlled firmness, the vibrations easing as the Black Hawk settled into place. "Landing complete," she reported. The cockpit fell into silence. For a long moment, the only sound was the whir of the rotor blades spinning overhead. Then, finally, the instructor's voice came through her headset. "Well," he said, his tone softer than before, "looks like you really can fly it." The words sent a quiet surge of pride through her. Not the pride of arrogance, but of vindication. When the blades slowed and the engines wound down, she climbed out of the cockpit, helmet tucked under her arm once again. The ground crew watched her with new eyes, no smirks, no whispered jokes this time, just silent acknowledgement. For her, though, the real victory wasn't in their stares. It was in the sky she had just conquered, the machine she had commanded, and the knowledge that the girl who once stared at the clouds had taken her place among them. The flight had been only a training mission, but it was her first real step into the life she had fought for. And deep down, she knew the tests ahead would be harder, more dangerous, more demanding. But she also knew something else. She was ready. Because now, she wasn't just the girl who said, "I can fly it." She was the pilot who proved it. The call came in on a day that began like any other. The sky was clear, a wide sweep of pale blue, and the base hummed with its usual routines, mechanics checking fuel lines, pilots reviewing flight plans, officers shuffling paperwork in fluorescent lit rooms. Yet beneath the hum of ordinary life, the unpredictable pulse of crisis always lingered. No one ever knew when it would strike. For her, the morning began with drills, nothing unusual. She had flown enough training missions now that the once overwhelming controls of the Black Hawk felt like an extension of her body. She strapped in, ran her pre-flight checks, and lifted the machine into the air for what was supposed to be another routine exercise. But war zones and training zones have one thing in common. Chaos has a way of rewriting the plan. Halfway through her exercise, her radio crackled to life with urgency. "Black Hawk 1, emergency directive. Stand by." Her pulse quickened. She steadied the cyclic, ears straining as the transmission continued. "Civilian structure under fire. Urban district east of Grid 7. Rooftop extraction required. Repeat, rooftop extraction required." Rooftop. Her stomach dropped. She knew what that meant. Landing a Black Hawk on uneven dirt was difficult. Landing one on a rooftop, surrounded by high-rise buildings, smoke, and unpredictable crosswinds, that was something else entirely. Even seasoned pilots approached it with dread. The voice in her headset cut through her thoughts. "Black Hawk 1, you are nearest. You are primary." She glanced at her instructor in the co-pilot seat. His face was unreadable, but his eyes told her everything. "This is yours." She tightened her grip on the controls. "Black Hawk 1, roger, en route." The city unfolded below as she pushed the helicopter forward. Smoke rose in black plumes from the eastern sector, staining the horizon. Roads jammed with vehicles. Sirens wailed. The air itself seemed tense, vibrating with urgency. Her knuckles whitened around the cyclic. She had practiced rooftop approaches in simulators countless times. She had memorized the checklists, rehearsed every maneuver. But this was no simulation. This was fire, chaos, and lives hanging in the balance. The radio buzzed again. "Be advised, enemy small arms fire in the vicinity. Rooftop hot, civilians waiting. Time critical." Her breath slowed. She forced herself to focus. Not on the fear, not on the danger, but on the task. Fly the machine, land the bird, save the lives. The rooftop came into view. It was smaller than she had imagined, barely large enough for the helicopter's skids, cluttered with antennas, ventilation units, and concrete barriers. People huddled near the edges, waving frantically, their faces pale with terror as smoke curled upward around them. Bullets cracked through the air, tracer rounds flashing in the distance. She could feel the instructor's gaze on her, but he said nothing. This was her moment. Approaching LZ, she called into the headset. Her voice was steady, though her heart thundered. The Black Hawk descended, blades slicing the smoke-filled air. The downdraft whipped debris into whirlwinds, scattering papers, dust, and fragments of rooftop gravel. The building itself groaned under the pressure, as if protesting the weight of what was about to land upon it. Every muscle in her body was tense, yet her hands moved with precision. Collective, cyclic, pedal small corrections, subtle movements, each one fighting the gusts that tried to shove the helicopter off course. Too fast and she would overshoot. Too slow and she would stall. Too heavy-handed and she would clip a wall or crush the civilians waiting below. The Black Hawk swayed violently as a gust of crosswind slammed into it. The tail rotor strained, alarms flickering. She bit down on her fear, adjusted her angle, countered the drift. "Hold it steady," her instructor murmured finally. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "I've got it," she said through clenched teeth. The rooftop rushed. Closer. Antennas loomed dangerously near the rotor arc. She adjusted her angle again, coaxing the helicopter into a hover just above the roof. The machine trembled like a beast on a leash, eager to break free. "Easy, easy," she whispered, not to her instructor, not to the civilians, but to herself and the Black Hawk itself. Then impact. The skids touched concrete. A jolt ran through the frame. For a moment, the helicopter threatened to bounce, to slide, to skid. Over the edge. She corrected instantly, lowering collective, steadying the descent. The Black Hawk settled into place, rotors still thrashing the air. Landing complete, she breathed. The rooftop exploded in motion. Soldiers and civilians rushed forward, ducking under the spinning blades, pulling children and wounded toward the open bay doors. The smell of smoke and cordite burned her nostrils. She could see the fear in their faces, but also something else, hope. She held the controls firm, keeping the helicopter steady as weight shifted inside, as chaos erupted. Around her, every instinct screamed at her to look, to watch, to make sure they all made it aboard. But her job was singular. Keep the bird alive, keep it balanced, keep it ready to fly. A shout crackled over the intercom. "All aboard. Go, go, go." She didn't hesitate. Pulling collective, she lifted the Black Hawk from the rooftop. The building fell away beneath them, smoke swirling in their wake. Gunfire erupted again, bullets snapping past, but the helicopter surged upward, free of the rooftop, free of the danger below. The city sprawled beneath her once more, and the people inside the aircraft safe now, alive, clutched each other. In relief. Her chest heaved, sweat dripping down her temple beneath the helmet. Her arms ached from the tension, but she didn't loosen her grip until the helicopter cleared the combat zone and leveled out over safe airspace. Only then did she allow herself to exhale. Back on the ground, hours later, the rooftop rescue was already spreading through the base like wildfire. Mechanics whispered about it in the hangars. Officers retold it in clipped tones over briefings. Pilots who once smirked at her now watched her in silence, the weight of respect heavy in their eyes. But for her, the real victory wasn't in their approval. It was in the memory of the rooftop, the smoke, the chaos, the desperate faces, and the knowledge that when the moment came, she had not faltered. She had landed the Black Hawk where few dared to try. And in that moment, high above the city, with lives depending on her, she had transformed from the girl they mocked into the pilot they would never forget. Because she hadn't just flown the helicopter. She had brought it home. The hangar lights buzzed faintly overhead as she guided the Black Hawk back to its bay. The helicopter's engine wound down in a long metallic whine, rotor blades slowing until the air finally settled. For a long moment she sat there, helmet heavy on her head, palms still pressed against the cyclic and collective. Her arms trembled, not from fatigue, but from the lingering shock of what she had just done. Beside her, the instructor removed his helmet in silence. He studied her profile with an expression that was neither surprise nor disbelief, but something heavier, something harder earned. Finally, he spoke. "You just saved lives today." The words were simple, but they carried weight. She nodded. Once, throat too tight to reply. By the time she stepped out of the cockpit, a crowd had already formed. Mechanics in oil-stained uniforms, fellow pilots, ground crew, everyone had heard the radio chatter. Word of the rooftop landing had spread faster than the smoke still curling in the distance. Did she really put it down on a rooftop? Someone whispered. With civilians still up there? No way she pulled that off. But as she walked across the hangar floor, helmet tucked under her arm, the murmurs fell into silence. People stared, and for once it wasn't with smirks or disbelief. It was something else, an uneasy respect, tinged with awe. She felt every eye on her, but she kept her head high. Not because she wanted to bask in it, but because the weight of their stares felt like a test. If she faltered now, they'd call it luck. If she stood tall, they might finally see the truth. She was no experiment, no novelty, no girl who thought she could fly. She was a pilot. Her boots clicked across the hangar floor until she disappeared into the debriefing room. The debrief lasted hours. Officers gathered around a long table, papers spread, radios replaying fragments of the mission. The smoke, the hostile fire, the civilians waving from the rooftop, all of it dissected, replayed, questioned. She sat straight-backed in her chair, answering every query with crisp precision. Altitude, wind speeds, descent angle, rotor clearance. At one point, a colonel leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Lieutenant, do you realize what you pulled off today? A rooftop landing under fire, in urban terrain, with civilians on board. That isn't just a mission, it's a benchmark." Her instinct was to downplay it, to say she had simply done her duty. But something in his tone told her this wasn't the time for modesty. She lifted her chin. "Yes, sir. I knew the risks. But I also knew if I didn't put the Black Hawk down, those people weren't going to make it out." The colonel studied her for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "Good answer." Outside the debriefing room, the atmosphere had shifted. Soldiers who once rolled their eyes at her presence now gave her curt nods of acknowledgement. Some even stopped her in the corridor, offering short, awkward words. "Hell of a landing today. Never thought I'd see that rooftop evac pulled off. You've got guts, ma'am." Each word landed heavier than the last. These were men who had doubted her from the start, men who had mocked her claim I can fly it. Now their tone had changed, not just from disbelief to belief, but from superiority to respect. Still, there were those who muttered about luck, about circumstances, about how one mission didn't make a pilot. She heard the whispers as she passed, felt the sideways glances. But now she didn't flinch, because for the first time, she no longer needed to prove herself to them. She had proven herself to the sky. The recognition grew beyond the base. Within days, reports of the mission circulated through official channels. Military dispatches summarized it with dry precision. Pilot executed rooftop extraction under hostile fire. Mission successful. All civilians evacuated. But soldiers don't tell stories like reports. They tell them in mess halls, in tents, around metal coffee cups at dawn. And every retelling grew sharper, brighter. She dropped the Black Hawk on a rooftop no wider than a parking space. Smoke everywhere. Enemy fire cracking past the rotors, and she didn't flinch. They said it couldn't be done, she did it anyway. The story spread, twisting across bases like wildfire, morphing from fact into legend. And in every version, her name was there. A week later, she was summoned to a ceremony. The sun beat down on the parade ground, rows of soldiers standing in formation, boots gleaming, uniforms pressed. Flags rippled in the wind. She stood at the front, sweat trickling beneath her collar, hands clasped behind her back. The general stepped forward, a medal gleaming in his hand. His voice carried across the ranks as he recounted the mission, the smoke, the civilians, the rooftop. She was mocked when she said she could fly. She was doubted at every turn. And yet, when the moment came, she did not hesitate. She landed that Black Hawk, and in doing so, she saved American lives. Then, in front of the entire base, he pinned the medal to her uniform. Applause erupted, not the scattered, half-hearted kind she had grown used to, but thunderous, unified, undeniable. She stood there, head high, shoulders squared, the weight of the medal pressing against her chest. And for the first time since she had stepped onto that base, she felt the weight of belonging. But recognition wasn't just medals and ceremonies. It was in the way her peers began to treat her. In the way commanders spoke her name during briefings. In the quiet nods exchanged in the hangar, where once there had been smirks. Her reputation had shifted. She was no longer the one who thought she could fly. She was the one who landed the rooftop. And though respect came late, it came deep. Because in the military, bravado meant nothing. Success meant everything. And she had succeeded where others would have failed. Yet, amidst the recognition, she remained unchanged in one vital way. She never lost sight of why she flew. It wasn't for medals. It wasn't for applause. It wasn't even for the respect that now filled the air around her. It was for the people on that rooftop, the terrified civilians waving through the smoke, the soldiers who clung to hope as the Black Hawk descended. For them, she had flown. For them, she had risked it all. And for them, she would do it again. In quiet moments, when the hangar was empty and the Black Hawk rested silently under the dim lights, she would walk up to its steel frame and rest her hand on its side. The helicopter, still scarred with dust and smoke, seemed almost alive. "You and me," she would whisper. Because while others saw her rooftop landing as a singular act of heroism, she knew it had been something more intimate, a dance between pilot and machine, trust forged in fire and chaos. She had asked the Black Hawk to do the impossible, and it had answered. Together, they had earned recognition. Together, they had become legend. The medal ceremony ended, but her story did not. For many soldiers, recognition was fleeting, pinned on their uniforms one day, forgotten in the blur of missions the next. But her rooftop landing carried something heavier, something that rippled. Beyond the base, the military had always been a place where reputations were carved from steel and fire. Most pilots became known for their hours logged, their precision in drills, or the missions they flew in silence. But she had become known for something else, defying doubt itself. The rooftop landing was not just about saving lives. It was about rewriting the unspoken rules that had kept pilots like her in the shadows. Whispers turn into teachings at first. Her story was told in fragments, half in disbelief, half in awe. But soon, it entered the classrooms. In the flight simulators, instructors pulled up the rooftop landing scenario. "Remember this," they told their students. "It has been done before. It can be done again. Don't ever think the limits are fixed." Young cadets, men and women, alike studied her decisions. Her descent angle, her throttle control, her refusal to abandon the mission when others might have pulled away. They learned not just the mechanics, but the mindset, that blend of boldness and precision that had saved lives that day. And though her name wasn't etched into every manual, the whispers followed every lesson. She's the one who proved it possible. A new kind of role model outside the military, her story took on a different shape. Articles appeared in local newspapers. Female pilot executes daring rooftop rescue. Television anchors replayed a grainy footage of the helicopter hovering above smoke, ascribing it with words like heroic, unbelievable, trailblazing. But to young women watching at home, it was something else entirely. It was permission to step into spaces they had been told weren't meant for them. Permission to believe that if she could drop a Black Hawk onto a rooftop under fire, then maybe their own dreams, no matter how outrageous, weren't impossible either. In classrooms across America, girls wrote essays about wanting to be pilots. Recruiters noticed an uptick in female applicants, citing the Rooftop story as inspiration. Her single act had planted seeds in places she would never see. Back at the base for her, legacy wasn't something she chased. She remained where she had always been, in the cockpit, strapped into the Black Hawk, visor down, voice steady over the comms. Missions came and went, each with their own risks, each demanding the same precision and resolve. But the way others looked at her had permanently changed. No longer was she the outsider struggling to be taken seriously. No longer the subject of ridicule when she had said, "I can fly it." Now, when new recruits arrived on base, veterans pointed her out. "That's her," they would whisper, "the Rooftop pilot." And for those recruits, especially the women who carried their own doubts, that whisper carried power. She didn't need to lecture them or deliver speeches. Her very presence was enough. She was living proof that doubt could be burned away by action. The unseen legacy years passed, and the world moved on. Conflicts shifted, new missions demanded attention, and the military, ever forward-looking, focused on what came next. But the Rooftop story lingered. It lingered in ways she couldn't always see. A young pilot, facing his first combat zone, remembered her tale and steadied his hands on the controls. A female cadet, mocked by her peers, repeated the words she had once spoken, "I can fly it." An instructor, reminding students of the limits of machines, added softly, "But don't forget what was once thought impossible." Her name became less important than the lesson itself. Courage could redefine what was possible. Personal reflection for her, the Rooftop mission never faded. She could still see the smoke curling upward, still hear the panicked voices over the radio, still feel the vibration of the rotors as the Black Hawk settled onto the rooftop. Sometimes, late at night, she would dream of it, the impossible descent replaying again and again. And each time, she remembered not the applause or the medal, but the faces of the civilians who had climbed aboard that day, clutching each other as the helicopter lifted them away from certain death. That was her true legacy. Not the respect of her peers, not the headlines, not even the cadets who now whispered her name with admiration. It was those lives, saved because she had refused to listen to doubt. The echo of her words, the phrase that once drew laughter, "I can fly it," took upon a new life. Among younger pilots, it became almost a saying, muttered before daunting missions. Not arrogance, but affirmation. A reminder that belief mattered, even when no one else believed with you. Years later, at reunions and gatherings, she would hear it spoken with a grin. "Come on, Lieutenant," you know what she'd say? "I can fly it." Her words had outgrown her. They had become a rallying cry. Recognition beyond rank, though she rose in rank over time. What mattered more was how her peers regarded her. She was not simply respected as an officer. She was trusted as a leader. When storms rolled in, when missions stretched the limits of endurance, when the question of "can it be done?" hung heavy in the air, eyes turned to her. And often, without fanfare, she would nod and say, we'll get it done. Because that was who she had become, not just a pilot, but a symbol of resilience. The broader legacy in time, historians of modern military aviation would record her rooftop landing as one of those rare turning points where skill met circumstance. And a single act shifted perception. Not because she had been the first woman to fly a Black Hawk, not because she had been flawless, but because she had carried the weight of doubt on her shoulders. And when the sky tested her, she had not broken. Her story was archived, studied, and told alongside countless others. But unlike so many tales that faded into footnotes, hers held a spark that could not be erased. Final reflection years later, long after her flying days had ended, she returned to that same rooftop. The building was still there, though its walls bore scars of time and conflict. She stood on the roof, boots crunching on gravel, and looked out at the skyline. For a moment, she closed her eyes and could hear it all again, the whine of the rotors, the crack of gunfire, the shouts of relief as the helicopter touched down. And standing there, she finally understood. Her legacy wasn't about proving herself right or silencing those who mocked her. It wasn't even about the medal or the stories or the way others remembered her. It was about this rooftop and what it represented. A place where doubt had once reigned, but where courage had written a new truth. She opened her eyes, took a long breath, and whispered the words once more, soft, steady, certain. I can fly it. And with that, her story lived on.